Hello and welcome to another virtual program with Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman. It is August 10th, 2021, and this is Cooking is Community, a look at historic Maine community cookbooks with Dawn Lindgren, Margaret Hathaway, and Karl Schatz. Let me introduce our speakers properly, and then I'm going to turn the program over to them to tell you about their work and about their new podcast, Cooking is Community. So Margaret Hathaway and Karl Schatz are the husband and wife team behind 5 books on food and farming, including the memoir, The Year of the Goat, The Guide to Living with Goats, and the 2 volumes of the Portland, Maine Chef's Table. Margaret is a writer who has worked in book publishing, corporate communications, and is manager of New York's Magnolia Bakery. Karl is a photographer who has worked as an editor at Time and as a director of Aurora Photos. Since 2005, they have lived with their daughters on 10 Apple Farm, a homestead in southern Maine, where they raise dairy goats, tend a large garden and small orchard, make cheese, teach workshops, and operate a guest house. Dawn Lindgren is an antiquarian bookseller specializing in printed and manuscript books about food and drink. His book-selling business, Rabelais, acquires, researches, and sells rare books, manuscripts, ephemera, and other materials related to culinary history and culture, and he performs appraisal and institutional placement services for collections and archives. He has lectured and presented at the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery, the Colorado Antiquarian Book Seminar, and Rare Book School's Boston seminars. And he is currently working on a multi-volume exploration of the American Community Cookbook titled, I may mispronounce this, Dawn, is this United American Cookbooks of Community and Place. Did I get that correct?
Everything except United. It's an acronym. It's UnXLD, and it was used by the church ladies in Connecticut in the 1880s, and it's UnXld. If you were to say the acronym out loud, it's UnXld.
Thank you for clarifying. Of course, they are all the hosts of this great new podcast, Cooking is Community. And so they've joined us here tonight to talk more about their research on these community cookbooks, specifically ones from Maine, and about their work on this podcast. Thank you all for being here with us this evening.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
It's great to be here. Thanks to the Maine Historical Society for hosting this event, and it's exciting to be able to talk live about community cookbooks.
Absolutely.
It's our pleasure.
Everything Karl said.
Here, I'll share my screen now because we've got some slides, and there, and I think people can still see us. So just a little bit about tonight's structure. We did an earlier talk about the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook, which is how it's not how we met. We've actually, Dawn and we have been friends for probably almost 20 years.
Close to 20 years.
Close to 20 years. But we came together in 2019 to work to collaborate on the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook, and that was really Margaret and my introduction to community cookbooks as a sort of a genre. I mean, we did encountered them casually, but until Dawn really sort of introduced us to them as a genre, we weren't particularly knowledgeable or as fascinated as we are today. And so I think tonight, the question we want to address is why community cookbooks? Like, what is it about community cookbooks that has sort of gotten us so interested, and why we're so excited about them, and why we are doing a podcast about them?
Yeah.
And I think that really starts with Dawn. So we're going, Dawn, we'll kind of, and there's the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook for if you're not familiar with that we worked on for the bicentennial. But Dawn, it's always good to have you sort of tell us what is a community cookbook. So we'll turn it over to you at this point.
Yeah, and you're going to have to rein me in, because if the topic is why are these things interesting, that's like I can go on and on. Anyway, so most of us have come into contact with community cookbooks. We grew up in a house that had community cookbooks, or we belonged to an organization that made money with community cookbooks. We've seen them at library sales and yard sales. They're sort of like everywhere. They're ubiquitous, but they're a genre. They have a specific definition, and the definition's been a little muddy for many years, but it seems to have coalesced around three things. So community cookbooks are cookbooks which were issued by a specific identifiable community. And by that, I don't mean I don't mean like a place. I don't mean a town or a city, but rather a social group, some sort of community organization within that place. So they're issued by a specific community. The recipes within the cookbook are gathered from members of the community. That's the second aspect of it, the second characteristic. So the recipes are supplied by people. They may not be, and they're very unlikely that they are, recipes created by those people, but rather just things they really liked that they may have sourced elsewhere. But they supply them to the group to put the book together. And the third thing is that the books have some sort of fundraising purpose. It's often not stated, but for the members of the community, it would have been obvious. And looking at the history of any of these groups, you can find out exactly why they were raising this money. So it's three things. Again, the social organization that's identifiable, recipes being collected from members of that same organization, and finally, some sort of fundraising purpose for the book that either raises money for an outside project, like helping something or other, or just perpetuates the organization's benevolent activities, which is more sort of a junior league sort of model. So those are the three things. There are a bunch of things we think about when we think about community cookbooks, like attributed recipes. And by that, I mean recipes where the names are supplied. And that's an important part of them, but it's not a characteristic that we find in all of them. Or we might see advertising matter in the books. And that's also really important and interesting, but we don't see it in all of them. And that's why there are some characteristics which are frequently encountered, but they're not generic to the category of community cookbooks. So that's the dry, bare bones version of what these books are.
Don, do you want to talk a little bit about how you got started, both collecting and then, kind of interested in what community cookbooks tell us about food history and cookbook history and really, your scholarship in this genre? Well,
yeah, I do. And it's it wasn't something that I expected. I mean, I had been a bookseller in other fields before I moved to Maine, and Samantha and I opened Rabelais after moving to Maine, and largely inspired by Maine. But I can't say I had any interest whatsoever in community cookbooks when we opened the shop. I mean, to me, they were these sort of unattractive, poorly designed plastic comb binding books that were kind of impenetrable. Like, what are these things? How do you find the good ones? How do you know? And it really could only work by talking to somebody who knew an individual book itself. So I wasn't really interested. I wasn't looking at them until I came across this book that you see on the screen, which is called Fish, Flesh, and Fowl, a book of recipes for cooking compiled by the ladies of State Street Parish. And it was published in 1877 in Portland. And this is the real first Maine cookbook of any sort. There are other printed cookbooks that precede this that are arguably Maine cookbooks and have something important and interesting about them, like Mrs. Appledor's, Maria Parlot's Appledore cookbook, originally issued in 1872. It's a little earlier. and it's associated with Appledore Island, which is part of Maine, just barely. But it really, the contents of the book itself really have nothing to do with Maine. It was other hotels she worked in prior. And there's even a book from 1807, which bears a Maine imprint, a Portland imprint of a stationer named T. Clark. And that was just a reprint of an English cookbook by Mrs. Rundle. Very important that it was printed in Maine. It's the only book remotely that early that's related to cookery, but it's not a Maine book in that it wasn't printed here. The contents have really nothing to do with Maine. It was merely a sort of pass along. So anyway, the Fish, Flesh, and Fowl had this great title. That's the first thing that caught my eye. It's a little book, but it's still sort of attractive. It has a section at the end of the book, and I can, for anybody who can still see this, at the very end of the book, there are lined blank pages that were clearly intended to hold additional recipes. And having had, like, I don't know, 7 or 8 of these at this point, I think I still have 4 of them in my collection. Most of them have additional recipes that were added. So the recipes were interesting. The form of the book, the typography is actually quite lovely. I like the typeface of the titles of the recipes that you see here: apple pudding, apple bread pudding. That typeface there intrigues me. And it was just a book that caught my attention. And I thought, I'm a bookseller, I'm in Maine. At the time, I knew of no one collecting community cookbooks or more broadly Maine cookbooks. And I thought I should start doing this. So I did. And I'll just, the very short version is 12 or 15 years later. I'm not exactly sure when. I'm not 100% sure about duplicates at this point. I've culled duplicates a bunch of times, but I still need to do another one. I think I'm around 870 individual titles of Maine cookbooks. And I think that shocks most people that there are that many books. And the most interesting thing, germane to what we're talking about tonight, the vast majority of those books are community cookbooks. And everything you're looking at here, again, we could argue about the Appledore book. And you could also argue about the Housekeeper's Friend with that very attractive color cover in the upper row. But well, that's for another time. But all of the rest of these are early Maine community cookbooks. They're from all over the state. And really, I have things from every decade, deep. To get to 800 and some odd books, you need a lot of books from every little community in the state, from every type of organization. And we'll talk about that kind of stuff later. But it's really exciting that these things were produced in small towns around the state, but also, of course, all over America, by all different kinds of people who wanted to do something as an organization, as a community social group. And we see in this one, you have the Fisherman's Fair, which is actually a fisherman's wives group, the mothers, Hockey Mothers Cookbook, Maine JCs, the Rebeccas. They're the employees of Maine Medical Center. So all different kinds of organizations, and there are really hundreds and hundreds of them. I just found one the other day by the Maine Caged Birds Society for people who liked having birds in cages. I'm presuming these are like songbird things and something like that.
Don, how are the poultry recipes in that book?
But all for chickens or larger, nothing small.
No ortolan.
No, sadly. So there are so many things that are attractive about these books. One of them is that you get a vision, and this is what Karl and Margaret have really managed to bring out in their projects with community cookbooks. But you get this real sense of what's going on locally through them, through the activities of the book, the activities that are being funded, the way the books are actually produced. How do these books come to be? That's another huge question. It's not like normal publishing. There's a group of people that have to figure out how to raise the funds in advance of printing so that they can then sell the book and make money, not just sell the book and pay the printer and the binder. So there's all sorts of DIY stuff going on. There's what we would call crowdfunding. The recipes, of course, crowdsourced. I mean, it's like just like lots and lots of creative activities that put these books together. So what happened with the collection of community cookbooks of Maine books is that is a personal collection and it's not for sale, and it's getting bigger and bigger. But I wanted to branch out beyond the Maine books to the other 50 states. And by the way, this does happen in other places, and mostly English language speaking places. It's not purely American, but it is largely an American thing. So I started a scholarly project to really investigate the books carefully and give even very simple and rather, I'll say, unassuming books a really thorough bibliographic treatment. So this is the first volume of what looks like it'll be a 6-volume. It's a bookseller's catalog. The books in this volume are for sale, so it's clearly a sale mechanism. But the books have these very long bibliographic studies and historical studies that were done by me from the collection, but also with great help from Mark Germer, who's been my cataloger and collaborator on this project. And it's going state by state. So the first volume was just Alabama through the District of Columbia. The second volume of Florida through Kentucky is finished, but not printed yet. And right now we're in the middle of Massachusetts somewhere, which is a really long state. We don't expect to complete any states. That's kind of what's going on with my Maine collection. And it shows you how it would be really rough to try to do all the states completely. But rather to show the sort of chronological arc. So each state starts with the earliest book that we have. And we try really hard to have some of the very earliest, if not the first community cookbook from each state. And then progresses right up to the current time. And we're not cutting them off. And I want to just make one quick explanation about why. When I started doing this, when I started with the Maine books, and then eventually with the broader community cookbooks, I kind of lost interest with them around 1945. And that was because that was really when the sort of comb binding, spiral binding, all of that stuff really kicks in. And it seemed to me like they lost their localness at that point. And there's some truth to that, although frankly, there's another whole set of interesting things that brings up, and specialty publishers and printers and whatnot. But there's another group of organizations that decided to do everything locally, not just locally, but like as DIY as they could. You know, they no longer had access to small binders and printers. So they started using all sorts of cool local materials and processes to make the books. And they made, well, you can see on this page here, there's a book that's actually, it's got very lovely printing, but the binding is just a simple 2 metal ring binder. So it's simply loose pages, hole punched, and then these little metal rings you could buy at the stationery store. And you find books that are stapled and sewn and tied on cord, and books that are made out of linoleum and wallpaper and every other kind of material, and printed using every kind of printing technology you can imagine, ditto and mimeograph, whatever they could get their hands on. And that continues to this day, that people are using what's really very inventive and creative techniques of producing these community cookbooks, because that's what's available to them. They reach out, they find these things in the school office, the church basement. You know, some member of the community has a flooring store, and so they get some linoleum and they cut it into pieces, and then they have bindings. It's really, really inventive. And I have to say that, having dealt one time a long time ago with artist books, that I find the range of materials to produce the books, the range of processes and technologies to print the books, and the types of creativity they bring to bear on the books is just as rich as what you see in the artist book world. So it's really fascinating.
Oh.
Wait, is that the wrong slide?
Well, I think that's our slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Don, I didn't mean to, I wasn't sure.
No,
what the
no, no.
next part was.
No, no. I mean, I could go on and on, as you can tell. It's hard to do this and not hear whether people laugh or groan when you say something like that. But I just want to see if there's anything that absolutely has to happen there before we move on. But no, I'm just gonna say that the for me personally, the value of having built this collection and being able to look at it is that I get to see patterns of within a genre that I've never seen before, because you can't look at things one at a time over a very long period of time and see those patterns. But when you have them on the wall, arranged state by state, or in the case of my Maine collection, which is in boxes by decades, you start to see patterns. You see how quickly did this thing spread. You see when were there changes in the materials that they used? When were there changes in types of ideas they wanted to put out, like the aspirational things that the compilers had that they wanted to show off? And as time will tell, as people are able to really dig deeply into the recipes, what were the changes in the food, to the actual uses of food, to the ways that it was cooked? We can see that now.
The boiling times of vegetables.
Boiling times of vegetables are much shorter than they used to be, as we know. And we see it in a lot of those early cookbooks, and it's kind of scary that 3-hour broccoli or whatever is just green water. But anyway, by having a big collection and being able to kind of play in it as a sandbox, the patterns reveal themselves. It's really neat to see those. They bring up all sorts of new questions that, as an historian, I like to follow, and occasionally it turns into something really interesting.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that there is so much material, right? As someone, someone who's studying something, right? If you're studying something where there's a limited amount of material, there's a limited amount of comparisons you can make, things you can learn. But there's so many of these community cookbooks, both here in Maine, as as you've been showing us, but also around the country, that if you really spend the time to examine them and look at them, you do start to see those kinds of like really interesting patterns.
And
Absolutely.
I think also one of the advantages of having a collection, of seeing them, and this is part of what turned us on and got us excited about the community cookbooks, from really your influence, Don, was just looking at these books as an artifact of a time and a place, and this intersection of so many different things. Each one of them is a collaboration of a lot of people. It can be placed in a very specific place, a very specific time. The project, that whatever they were trying to fund, demonstrates their values and demonstrates what the community really wanted to ensure was their legacy. And for us, like each book, as we started looking at these books with you when we were putting together the Bicentennial Community Cookbook, it just opened up a new way of thinking about these books, which I think, to my embarrassment now, I had really written off as just sort of amateurish work, and that's not how I feel about them now.
Well, they are. I mean, amateurish is a word that once was a very positive word, and I think we give it negative.
Right. The Olympics are amateurish.
The Olympics are amateurish. In France, the word amateur is used to describe somebody who's a great expert, but not a paid professional. And you see that in collecting. If somebody collects a fantastic art collection, they're an amateur. But it's also, I actually like the word vernacular, although it doesn't really apply to cooking very much. But there's a lot of respect that one can have for fantastic architecture, or that's built by people who are not trained architects. And of course, throughout history, that's a lot of what we have. And there's a whole history of amateur scientists and philosophers and all sorts. Everybody now is very professionalized, but I'm very attracted to people who have to like do workarounds and figure out how to make things work when the obvious answer is not presented. And I think one of the things that didn't in all of my blabbing there that I didn't mention is that these are predominantly produced by women. There are some exceptions, but it's really 99% women until you get much later in the history of them, or quite recent in the history of them. And that these women were working with a set of constraints, depending on exactly where and when you were. If you look at these, many times women couldn't have a bank account, they couldn't sign a contract. So the idea of going out and having a book published and printed and distributed was, it couldn't happen in a long traditional means, certainly not within a very small local community. I mean, there were women authors of cookbooks that go way back, but the idea of going to a printer and just signing a contract and to publish something, that was really, if it was not easy, if it was allowed at all. In the early years. And so they had to barter, they had to trade things, they had to promise the advertising to other members of the community, which is one of the ways that's a workaround. And the last thing I'll mention about the women, and this is like a million aspects of the women's involvement here that's really interesting, but the fundraising aspect of these books was not minor. These books raised a lot of money, and I did research back in 2019 on the books as really a vehicle of empowerment for women in America in the 19th century. And I spent more time than I ever want to spend in the archives and of like congressional church building and things like that, a congregational church building. I don't ever want to go back into that set of archives again. It's just not that appealing to me. But what I learned was that the money raised by women through their efforts in church organizations, including the cookbooks, produced a huge amount of the money that built churches, sometimes as much as 2/3 of the money that went into building a church, especially if we're talking about like something on the plains in the 1880s. We're talking about a wood structure and whatnot. That may have been completely financed by a cookbook. And that goes for, there are lots of public buildings, there's libraries and hospitals and grange halls. A lot of early, I don't want to say early American because these things are really post-Civil War, but a lot of early town civic structures have these community cookbooks baked into them.
Well, and that's something we've talked about a lot in the podcast, which we should probably start talking about the podcast.
Yeah.
But one thing that we continually note in the podcast is how these groups of mostly women volunteers who were unable to earn their own money were responsible for essentially paying the townspeople. Right? They kept the economy going through this act of volunteerism and through these books. And looked at in that light, these books become even more important and essential to the building of the America that we live in, that we know.
Yeah, an integral piece of small town, and sometimes not so small town America, as the landscape changed all the way through today, really.
That's another topic for a podcast when we find exactly the right books. But the idea, that sort of distinction between the small town community cookbook and the big city community cookbook, we have loads of examples of both. But it's an interesting, the form is so similar, but it's going to give up some interesting facts when we dig deeper.
So maybe we can talk a little bit now about just about the podcast and how we came to create that.
Are you putting this up as like a subliminal, trying to get people to send us their recipes?
I think it's the order of how things happen chronologically. So after the success of the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook, which was a tremendous success, we are about to enter our 5th printing of the book. The charitable cause of the book, which was to raise money for organizations in Maine fighting hunger, and we've distributed more than $15,000 to those organizations at this point, and we'll be distributing more later this year. And that really made us think, and a lot of people sent us emails, about how much they love the book and wish that they'd known when we were collecting recipes they wanted to submit their family recipe and story. So that really inspired us to do a second volume, which we are in the process of working on right now. And so if you're watching and you have a family recipe you want to submit, it's Maine200cookbook.com, and you can send us a recipe and a story, and we would love to consider it for inclusion in the second book. But at the same time, we just, we knew we needed to keep doing something with these community cookbooks, and keep investigating them. And we came up with this idea of doing a podcast about community cookbooks. We're both podcast fans.
Yeah.
We listen to a lot of podcasts.
All three of us are.
Yeah. And it just seemed, we first, looked to see if there were any podcasts about community cookbooks already, and there weren't. So that seemed like fertile ground. And we started, choosing some different books and thinking about a format, which started with just conversations about, individual books that we would start with. And so we selected, we started with selecting 5 books that are the episodes we've done so far. Fish, Flesh, and Fowl was the first episode we did. And the format was to talk about the cookbook, but we really wanted to delve into each of the 3 pillars of the community cookbook that Dawn mentioned at the beginning, which is, the defined community that put it together, the recipes that were coming from that community, and the charitable cause. And we kind of wanted to have 3 sections of each episode where we would address those 3 things. So if you've listened to the podcast, you'll sort of recognize that. And we have well, it was interesting. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about the narrative intro, because that's kind of a 4th section that we sort of stumbled on that was necessary.
Well, when we first started talking about Fish, Flesh, and Fowl, and the structure is that we talk about the book as an artifact. We talk about something that's an interesting characteristic of the book, and then we all cook something from the book and then taste it and talk about how it was to cook. Cooking something from a book from 1877 is very different than something from 1955. And so those were the three essential pieces of the podcast that we started with. And as we started thinking about it more and delving deeper into the idea of these communities, we also felt like there needed to be some historical contextualization of what this community was. So are we looking at Orono?
This is Orono. Yeah.
Okay, so not Fish, Flesh, and Fowl. This is the Orono cookbook from 1906. And the pictures in it bring people to life, the recipes, the little side notes, all of these things really made the book come to life. And then thinking about the larger community that it was going out into, I started doing a little research about each book. And each podcast begins with just a short intro of a couple minutes of what that town looked like in that time.
Sets the time and place.
Sets the time and place before we start looking at the book, to see sort of what was going on, what was this town about at the time. And sticking within Maine, as someone who is a transplant to Maine, it has really helped me understand my adoptive state too. So yeah. And then
the last component is trying to make a modern day connection to these books whenever they're from. And so we find someone today who has some kind of connection to the book, and we do a short interview with them and to bring in another voice. And in the case of Orono, we actually had 2 really interesting interviews. One of the ads, so we really, with the Orono cookbook, we were focused a lot on the advertising in the book, which is really interesting to see the kinds of businesses that were advertising at the turn of the century in Maine. But one of the ads, well, there are actually two ads here, which are national ads. They're not Maine companies or local companies. And so we reached out to a scholar who had written a book about the Baker Chocolate Company, and we interviewed him. But then to bring it back home to Maine, we interviewed, there's an ad in the cookbook for Benoit's clothing store. And we reached out to Joan Benoit Samuelson, who is a descendant of the founder of Benoit Clothing. And we had a chat with her.
Olympian.
And a Olympic gold medalist, Joan Benoit Samuelson. And we were able to have a conversation with her, not about the Olympics, but about cookbooks and gardening
and her family's
clothing store. And it was a lot of fun. And it's a lot of fun to sort of make those connections. This is another book that we talk about on the podcast that is from Lewiston. And Dawn, I thought, once we got to Lewiston and some of these later books, we started sort of talking about some of the books that you were sort of dismissed in your early, collecting, right?
The comb bind.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the comb binding books, for example, that was the thing that, and generally speaking, booksellers hate comb bound books. They break easily. If you put them in a box on top of each other, they're likely to break. If you put them on the shelf, you can't, there's usually nothing on the spine to read, so that it becomes hard to find. There's just a lot of reasons that we look down on them for a long time. But these had all sorts of other things going on. First of all, there's a whole technological bookmaking history that's barely been scratched, of the spiral binding, the comb binding. There's all different kinds of metal binding structures, and there's almost nothing in the sort of special literature of the history of binding about them. The other thing is that these books are all made by these big specialty publishers in the Midwest, because there had to be somebody that could step into the gap to produce these like small run books inexpensively. And it was very hard to do that on big modern lithographic book printing and binding equipment. So, and all the little local little binders and printers that you used to find in every town in the 1880s and 1950s, they were all gone. It all just got consolidated. So people turned to these other publishers, and that created another whole sort of piece of somewhat strange elements of publishing. But enable these people to enable the community groups to continue to put these things out and to continue to use them for fundraising. There were other groups that were going the DIY way, but the ones who used the comb binding and other commercial but inexpensive binding techniques actually were doing something pretty cool. The other thing that happens with these books that really got me to commit to just taking any community book or any book from Maine and including it in the collection was that the type of organization, and here's the perfect book to illustrate that, the type of organization represented in these books after my arbitrary 1945 cutoff date was totally different. So the community groups changed as America changed, as the state of Maine changed, and the fundraising purposes changed as Maine changed, as America changed. So you see a book like this one, Far Away and Down East, which is put together and it's recipes from the Maine refugee community. And I would remind us all that if we look at that list of countries, it's a different list of countries that comes to mind when we think about today's refugee community. But this is representative of the moment when this book was produced.
Which was this cookbook is from the mid 80s.
Yeah, mid 80s.
Yeah.
So it makes much more sense that there be many more people coming from Southeast Asia. Poland is in there because we're coming out of the solidarity moment and the fall of, or the beginnings of the fall of the Soviet Empire. Afghanistan and Iran, sadly, still on the list, producing a lot of refugees today. So anyway, it's representative of its moment. It's looking at groups of new Mainers, which is really exciting to see. And making money as a fundraising object for different purposes than the ones we would have seen if I had cut my own collection off in 1945. And this is another one. This is by the way, I found a book just recently that represents the organization that is on the other side of this.
Oh,
Oh,
really?
really?
Yes, yeah,
Oh.
actually two from the same organization.
That might be a bonus episode.
It may have to be. So this was actually a cookbook that was produced specifically to fight potential state legislation. So, that's a very specific new kind of cause. Forgetting about what the legislation was, the idea that you would raise money using a community cookbook in order to fund a fight against proposed legislation it's a new type of mechanism. Although there certainly were temperance and suffrage cookbooks. The temperance cookbooks in Maine, yes, I have yet to see a suffrage related cookbook in the state of Maine, but nationally they were quite important and raised a lot of money. So this was a book done in support of gay rights, and of course, it gives us, this is something you don't see in the other ones, but this whole history of gay rights legislation in the state. So, when you look at these modern books, and just to think back upon the Lewiston Band Booster book, and I could say there are easily 8 band booster cookbooks that I can think of in the state of Maine alone. I'm sure there are more than that, but the idea that it became a thing to raise money for marching bands, and it became a thing to raise money for groups of motorcycle enthusiasts. Whatever there's a book that came out maybe 10 years ago called oh my gosh, I'm confusing the title with something else. Bowling Alone. And it's basically a book that says that the community organization in America has collapsed, and we no longer have the activities we once did. And I don't know what the last 10 or 15 years means for that sort of statement, but I can tell you that leading right up to it, what these books show you is that some of those activities do go away, but there's another whole set of activities right underneath them. They may not unite us all the same way they once did, but it's the idea that these other groups come up in whether they're tiny or big, and they represent different types of activities, different types of thought, different types of aspirations of Mainers. And I find that exciting. I think it's a really interesting look at what people care about at any one slice of time or slice of geography.
Yeah, and I think these are all the considerations as we've been sort of producing the podcast and thinking about what books we're going to talk about. Those are all the kinds of discussions that we've had, and the different books we've looked at, wanting to try to present that landscape of the differences between communities, between charitable causes, and also geographic. So the last couple books I think we've done have been, even though they're very different communities, they've been mostly centered in southern Maine. So for the next episode, which will hopefully come out in a couple weeks, we're heading north up to Presque Isle. We're gonna and back in time. Yeah, we're back in time and up north, and we're gonna be doing this. It's a really interesting community cookbook, and another great title. They were really good with their title. Actually, all the cookbooks I think we've done have had really good titles. Clever titles.
They were, and there are moments though that and this has to do with this sort of going to some of these big centralized publishers, but there were moments where exactly the same title was used in there's What's Cooking in Name Your Maine Town was very popular, and they used the same photograph on the cover of many of them. It's this sort of stylized tree with a lobster boat in the distance, and it's kind of sad when you see that the localness go out of them, but the localness can then be found in other ways. It's not that's the cool thing about these, and the thing I really have to thank you guys for is through the process of doing the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook, I was exposed to like what it's like to be involved in making one of these things. And it was fun to do. And I would do it again well, I am doing it again in a second.
We are doing it again. Don't
Volume
forget.
2, but I also learned a lot about the process, which kind of comes to bear on my thinking when I'm looking at things in a kind of scholarly way. And now with the podcast, where we go deeply into one book and we talk, we're thinking about it and talking about it for like a week or two before we get to the actual discussion that's recorded. And of course, we're cooking out of it a bit. And then when I always have this moment when I listen to or even I just read the text, but it's better when I listen to Margaret's introduction and it contextualizes this thing. And it's suddenly like, okay, here I am in this place right before this, it's whether the marching band is in the background on the football field in Lewiston, or it's, seagulls in Casco Bay, and the historical background that you give us as context. It really, I mean, no matter how much I've studied these things, it like puts it into a different sensibility for me. And I appreciate it. And it's useful for me, but it's also fun.
Yeah.
Thanks. They're fun to explore. It's, there's so much that's digitized now that it makes it so thrilling to go back
to hold one of these books in your hand,
to hold one of these books in my hands, and then be able to find newspaper clippings from the same place, that the University of Maine has online, which is also wonderful. But yeah. Oh, plugging this again.
Yeah. Well, here we go. I think we're probably close to. We probably should be taking some. Yes, we're right. We're right up against questions.
Yeah.
So, if we want to go to questions now.
Yeah, thank you all very much. This was it's an interesting podcast, and this was a really great opportunity to hear you guys delve into where the podcast came from and some of the things that you're looking at a bit more. I know at least one person in the audience has asked, where can you purchase cookbooks like this, whether they're just old community cookbooks or antique cookbooks in general? Certainly, Dawn, there's your business, but where else can people tell us a little bit more about your store, and also about where can people find these cookbooks?
Well, this is the great news about people who are interested in community cookbooks is they're out there and not very hard to find. I bought almost 3,000 of them a week and a half ago in Belfast.
Which we're really excited to look at, Dawn.
Yeah, it's very exciting, but it's also sort of overwhelming. But not all those are from all over the nation. There were a lot from Maine, but one of the cool things about cookbooks in general and community cookbooks is that they're almost always these books at a yard sale or the flea market or the library sales and any of those sorts of local sales. It's a category of things that they're there, and they're usually inexpensive. I see someone's answer. So yeah, community thrift stores, bookshops,
transfer station.
Sorry, say it again.
Oh, the transfer station.
Yes, the transfer. Well, I've never found a good one at my transfer station, but I found lots of other good stuff there. But it's the other thing is that the early ones are actually very rare, and you can still find them, which is there aren't very many types of rare books that you can go out on a weekend and drive around and go to bookshops and antique malls and have a decent chance of going home with an otherwise completely unrecorded book, meaning that there's not a copy in any research collection anywhere in the world. And almost 25% of the books in my collection are unrecorded, and another 25% of the books in my collection, there's only one known copy of the book besides the one I have. So they're really scarce, but they're still out there. And I shouldn't be telling you to go look for them because I just myself. And then of course I have them. I do have lots of duplicates. I have some of the rare ones in duplicates, and I have I have a lot of the other ones that are not particularly expensive or scarce, but I love them for all the reasons we just talked about. So I like having them, and so that when somebody comes in and says, "Do you have this book from?" Somebody just contacted me about the Brownie Schrumpf book, which is a great book, kind of on the edge of community cookbooks, but it's and I had an extra for them, so I was happy about that.
I think the idea that there may be only 1 or 2 copies of these books around, it appeals to the part of me that needs to remember humility, that, you can put so much effort into something and every little decision can be such a big deal. And then there may only be just one left that is in a box in, somewhere in your house, Dawn, that people have worked so hard on something that in some ways is so concrete and in some ways is so ephemeral. And I think for me, that's what makes the exploring all of these and doing the podcast such an interesting project each time we start looking at a book.
Well, it's bringing the books back to life in a way.
Yeah, and all the people.
Funny, because I was just going to say, sometimes
Yeah.
when you find those stories, whether it's in a cookbook or a letter or a photograph, in like your grandmother's attic or a library or something, you do kind of, it hasn't happened to me very often, but when it does sort of feel like bringing a person back to
Mhm.
like someone that just, for whatever reason, that particular moment in time or their story has kind of been lost. It sort of feels like you're saving a life when all of a sudden, whether something as small as a recipe out of a book or a photograph out of an album, all of a sudden that person.
Yeah.
Well, can I just say, with the Lewiston band book,
Yeah.
the man that Karl interviewed, who had worked on it, had absolutely no recollection of working on it. His name was all over it,
but had no memory of
it. But the recipe that Karl made from it was a tongue recipe. That was his mother's tongue recipe. And this man had been a vegetarian for 30 years. But hearing that our 9-year-old daughter loved his long dead mom's tongue with raisin recipe, it just made the world feel like more connected and smaller, and made Mrs. Cohen, however briefly, come visit our dining room. And that those little moments just are so important to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's really special.
Yeah.
I think that's an experience too. I can remember, in my own family, trying to get a recipe for something, and I forget if I knew it was on a card or in a cookbook or something, and at one point someone said, "I'm sure you can find it online." And I said, no, I need that. Like, one of the things I love about a familiar old recipe are the splatter stains, the page, and that, like when you can see a page dog-eared or written on because it was a really beloved recipe. For me, part of a favorite recipe are the memories coming back. And so having the book or the card or wherever it is, whether it's someone's handwriting or just like the fact that it's old and been used so many times, that's all part of the experience. I think when you're cooking, when you're cooking something that's an old favorite, whether you're making it for the first time or the 100th time.
I think it was one of the
that those cookbooks have, that when you download a recipe from the
it's not the same. I think that's one of the things when we were working on the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook, we had a lot of recipes submitted that people were submitting recipes that were there. We're coming from community cookbooks. Sometimes it was family recipes that their grandmother or great aunt had contributed to a community cookbook and were still cooking. Sometimes it was just a community cookbook that they had adopted this recipe and had become their family recipe. And just the idea that these community cookbooks have connected people and sort of were such an important piece of transmitting family recipes over time. I think it was one of the things when we were working on the Bicentennial Community Cookbook that really struck me and sort of fueled further my interest in community cookbooks and wanting to sort of explore them more and think about those connections and how personal that is. And also it's very personal, but it's also, it tells us something about history. And I think well, I know.
Yeah, and people are sharing stories like that in the chat. I know one audience member says they were looking for a family's coffee cake recipe, and it showed up in a synagogue cookbook submitted by a cousin whose mother had made it for all those holidays. And
Yeah.
I love hearing stories like that. Don, what were you going to say?
To tie this idea of these things passing, through generations or across friends and family through recipe sharing. One of the other things that's really neat about community cookbooks and the form that we're talking about of recipe sharing is that it's one of the last places that you see the way cookbooks were produced for 400 or 500 years. That almost all recipe collections, going back to medieval times, are compilations that were gathered from different places. And I've had the privilege of handling some collections from the 18th century and early 19th century, where you got to see a family's manuscript cookbook that was then marked up with copy, and then the next book from the very same family with the recipes that had been copied and other things then stuck into it. And then the next generation having stuff from the second book plus the stuff that was stuck into it. So you got to see like these recipes passing from generation to generation within a family or sometimes sideways. And it was a living document that was, wasn't something people referred to. They added to it, like you were saying, they added to it, and then it had all this evidence that got gathered with splatters and people's little markups and stuff like that. But what we have today in the community cookbook, the ones that are still made now, like the synagogue book that's being made now, it was the same person who mentioned the coffee cake mentioned that their synagogue is making another edition of a community cookbook. It's the same process that people used 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. And that's really neat because it's a process that happens within a community that's otherwise, I don't know where else I would see that process.
For everything that has changed for how we
it's stayed the same.
Something that's been a constant, for centuries.
Yeah.
Else in the audience is asking, what is the most unique recipe that you have come across?
Most unique? Well, I mean, we've cooked. I mean, what are I'm trying to think of some of the interesting recipes that we've cooked.
Or maybe even just something that's stuck out in your mind, that's just, I don't know, really jumped out at you as, oh, we've never seen that before, or just kind of sparked your personal interest.
I'm going to grab something while you guys talk.
Oh,
okay.
Oh, okay. Wow.
I think he has.
Has something good.
He has something.
I think there were some things that we decided not to cook.
Yeah.
That when we're going through the very early books, especially baking is very difficult because they were baking with wood stoves or coal heated stoves, and so there's no dials, there's no temperatures,
right.
Timings are very different,
no standard measurements yet.
The instructions are things like egg this butter the size of an egg, or butter the size of a walnut, or
bake until
that's when you guys start making merchandise for the podcast, that needs to be on a t-shirt or a bumper sticker or something.
The size of an egg.
So I think it's really fascinating to see how just the way recipes are written and the way things are measured now compared to
Gills.
When things were when measurement started changing and being more precise, and so I think that's been fascinating to look at the recipes.
And I think what always surprises me, and we were just looking through I'm looking over here because I have it, the Presque Isle, this book that we're talking about next, and I was flipping through, and there's a cauliflower ragu recipe that actually looks amazing, like something I would find, in like
In a modern
language or
cookbook.
something.
Yeah.
It looks very contemporary. So
Now
I'm
I'm gonna go
obviously
look that up.
going to make it, but also this is from 1891 when the boiling time for asparagus was like
an hour.
hours.
Yeah.
And yet they get cauliflower right. So I love finding those things and wondering, like, who is making these rules, or was it really,
Yeah.
everyone was doing things differently?
It's-
Don, did you find?
I did, and this is actually I'm going to share one that'll I'm going to guess it's going to end up in volume 2 of the community cookbook, and we've talked about this before. Most of the recipes get submitted directly to the website, and because it's just easy, you can go on there and type it in, and we can also then go back to you if we have a question. But some people prefer to mail things in, and they mail them to me in the shop, and I'll just. So this came from Joan Gregoire in Nobleboro, and she has a picture of her grandmother Lydia. Oops, yeah, that's the right camera. Lydia Ford Keene, and then she supplied a menu, a bill of fare that would have been served aboard the John R. Kelly, and this woman Lydia Ford Keene served on the ship, and it was her father was the captain of the ship. Wow. And she was the cook. And it talks about what she was. I mean, the menu has a list of what she was cooking for this one trip. But what's so interesting is that on the menu is cod sounds and tongues, and it's cod bladders and tongues, which of course is it's very unusual. There's all sorts of stuff that is cooked and eaten by people everywhere in the world that never ends up in their cookbooks. And it's, like the cookbooks are only a partial record of what people were eating.
Right.
A little aspirational. People want to put their happy stuff in there. And not that cod sounds and tongues weren't good or even potentially delicious, but it's sort of it would be classified as offal. And it's like whole fish eating, which is now suddenly super hot again, just in the last couple of years, like whole pig eating was. But the idea that this is, being served on a ship makes perfect sense, because this is what they had, and we're going to use all the parts of the fish. But she also supplies the book, a scan from the book where the recipe was. So I thought that was really unusual, not just because the dish was weird. A lot of people are like, oh, cod bladders, like ick. And I get that, but it's because it was a recipe from like an unusual place, like shipboard, and we actually know who this person is, and then we actually know where they got the recipe. It's like it wasn't her recipe; it was a recipe from this book that they've informed us about. And I thought that is, to me, that's like really remarkable, because you have the personal story. You have this aspect of Maine's history, of its maritime culture, is reflected. We went looking for lighthouse recipes, and that was very hard for the first book, and we didn't really succeed in finding like things that we could explicitly say were lighthouse recipes. You guys may have some at MHS, but the idea that that's it's just 3 little pieces of paper with not very many words on them, and yet there's this whole world of story right there. So, and I'm going to leave one other unusual recipe, not because it's weird, because it's not. It's totally normal. Because there's a question I have for the audience and anybody who cares. I have reason to believe that the brownie really does have serious Maine roots. It's something that's been brought up in a lot of the dictionaries and histories of baking and whatnot, and everybody dismisses it. Oh, this is a story about Maine, but whatever, and they leave it. They don't bother to follow up. So the community cookbooks and the process of researching the Bicentennial Community Cookbook led me to this brownie recipe it was just chance, and it's referred to as a Bangor brownie. and it was from a Rockland or Rockport. Well, it was another mid-coast town, or it was a mid-coast town, and the recipe is for a Bangor brownie, and it precedes the earliest known brownie recipe by a bit.
Wow.
And the earliest known recipe that you would actually say is a brownie. There was a thing in the 1890s where those little characters called brownies made it into recipe titles, but it's not a brownie. It's like a cookie that's no chocolate. It's not a brownie. Anyway, if anybody in the audience, if there's anyone left, knows of family recipes for brownies that they think are very old, especially in the mid-coast area, or a family has a recipe that's like in their family cookbook or something like that, I'd love to hear about it, because I want to go as far back as I can in identifying the earliest printed brownie recipe I can find, but I'm also interested in like what happens in Maine after that, right up till today, because we don't think of the brownie as a Maine thing.
No.
But it's looking to me like it has, serious roots in Maine, and possibly an origin story here too, which is exciting.
So that's great. A call to action. Everybody,
Yes.
listening, if you've got an old Maine brownie recipe, please let Dawn, Margaret, or Karl know. And that leads into, we'll make this our last question from the audience. Someone is asking, where and when can they get the new cookbook? If they've entered a recipe already, can they enter another one? And I know I shared that website in the chat, but if you could just speak to that a little bit more as we close, that would be great.
Sure. So we're currently collecting recipes through October 1st. So the deadline for submitting recipes and family stories is October 1st. You can submit as many recipes as you like. I mean, most likely we will only publish one. But yeah, please send us your recipes and the stories behind them. And then the book will be will be available for pre-order sometime in the fall. We may do we did a Kickstarter campaign for the first book. We may do that again and have people be able to pre-order the book through that Kickstarter campaign.
But it will be out April 15th.
April 15th, it'll be out in time for Mother's Day of next year.
So what a wonderful gift to give your mother,
Right.
if you put a recipe of hers or her family.
Yeah.
And you can buy the Bicentennial, the first edition, that's available now through Maine Historical Society. So if you visit, and you've got Margaret's got a copy there, Don's got a copy behind him.
Don has one behind him.
So if you visit mainhistorystore.com, you can purchase that book. And we have a lot of other great books on Maine food and food ways. And we're looking forward to this new one coming out. I'm certainly a listener of your podcast, and I hope everyone in the audience will be listening soon. It's called Cooking is Community. You can subscribe and listen, I would imagine, wherever you find a podcast.
Wherever you get your podcasts.
And the website for the podcast is communitycookbook.com.
Right. And when we cook recipes from the podcast, we put those recipes on the website and pictures
and the evidence
and the pictures of the recipes. So you can, cook along with us if you like. And we're looking forward to, continuing our exploration of community cookbooks, and the rest of, we're doing probably another 7 or 8 episodes will be our first season, and those will all be Maine cookbooks. We're starting with just focusing on Maine cookbooks, and then hopefully we'll do a season 2 that will begin to branch out and dive into some of the other cookbooks that Dawn has collected from around the country.
Wonderful. Well, we'll be following along, and again, thank you all. Dawn, Margaret, Karl, thank you so much for being here and sharing your research and expertise with us. Thank you to the audience for spending some time with us. And I hope that we'll see everybody back here for another program soon.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you so much. Yes. Have a good night.